Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Welcome to the Poison Culture Podcast, where people of interest start our news. I'm your host, Cody Gregory, and in this episode, I'm going to take a closer look at the mysterious life and death of the great American author and poet, Edgar Allan Poe. 174 years after his death, Poe's literary works and he himself are still highly influential in today's pop culture. In some form or version, everyone has come across a telling of the Raven, or seen his likeness in costumes and characters portrayed on TV. I am extremely excited for Mike Flanagan's take on Poe's story, The Fall of the House of Usher, being released on Netflix later this year. If you have seen The Haunting of Hill House, The Haunting of Bly Manor, and Midnight Mass, you know Poe's story is in good hands with Mike Flanagan. It seriously can't come soon enough. Edgar Allan Poe is considered a master of Gothic literature and is credited for contributing to the development of modern detective stories, laying the groundwork for future characters for the likes of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Poe is often credited as an influence for many horror writers, including Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft, for his telling of Gothic horror and the macabre. His works, which include poems, short stories, and a novel, are known for their dark themes, complex characters, and intense atmosphere. Poe's writing has influenced many writers, artists, and filmmakers, and his stories and poems are still widely read and studied today. Poe's life was marked with a number of personal and professional struggles. Born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 19, 1809, his father abandoned the family 2 years later, and his mother died of tuberculosis a year after that. Poe was taken in by a successful merchant, John Allen, and his family in Richmond, Virginia. Although not formally adopting him, they gave him the name Edgar Allan Poe. In 1815, the Allens moved to the United Kingdom, where Poe went to school in Scotland and London before moving back to Virginia in 1820. In 1826, Poe went to the University of Virginia to study ancient and modern languages. During his time there, he grew estranged from the Allen family, and the following year, Poe gave up university over increasing gambling debts. He traveled back to Boston and found work as a clerk and a newspaper writer. However, unable to support himself, he enlisted into the United States Army as a private in May of 1827. That same year, he released his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, a 40-page collection of which only 50 copies were printed. He received praise from an influential critic at the time, John Neal, to which Poe dedicated a poem to Neal in his second book, Alaraf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, published in Baltimore in 1829. Wanting to leave the army, he got himself formally court-martialed and discharged, and left for New York in 1831, where he released his third volume of poems, simply titled Poems. Poems was financed partially by his fellow cadets at West Point, with many donating 75 cents to the cause, raising $170, to which he dedicated the book to. Poe returned to his aunt, brother, and cousin in Baltimore later that year, and soon began making honest attempts to start his career as a writer. The Baltimore Saturday Visitor awarded him a prize in October of 1833 for a short story he wrote. Soon after, Poe became assistant editor of the periodical. He published several poems, book reviews, critiques, and stories in the paper. In 1838, Poe released the book The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. The work relates to a tale of young Arthur Gordon Pym, who stowed away aboard a whaling ship called the Grampus. Later that year, Poe became assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman magazine in the summer of 1839. Poe left Burton's about a year after and found a position as a writer and co-editor at the then very successful monthly Graham's magazine. Poe married his cousin Virginia Clem on May 16, 1836. He was 26 and she was 13, with a witness falsely claiming Virginia as age 21. Not an uncommon practice at the time. In January of 1842, Virginia started to show first signs of having tuberculosis. It had appeared that she, as Poe described it, as breaking a blood vessel in her throat while singing and playing the piano. She only partly recovered and Poe began to drink more heavily under the stress of her illness. He left Graham's magazine and attempted to find a new position. He returned to New York, where he worked briefly at the Evening Mirror before becoming editor of Broadway Journal, and later became its owner. Poe's best-known fiction works are Gothic horror. His most recurring themes deal with questions of death, including physical signs, the effects of decomposition, concerns of premature burial, the reanimation of the dead, and the mourning. Many of his works are generally considered part of the dark romanticism genre. On January 29, 1845, Poe's poem The Raven appeared in the Evening Mirror and became a popular sensation. It made Poe a household name almost instantly. The poem is often noted for its musically stylized language and supernatural atmosphere. The poem tells of a distraught lover who is paid a mysterious visit by a talking raven. The lover is lamenting the loss of his love, Lenore. The raven antagonizes the lover with his constant repetition of the word nevermore. It remains as one of the most famous poems ever written, though Poe was only paid $9 for its publication. In 1846, Poe moved to the cottage in Fordham, New York, in the Bronx. Virginia died at the cottage a year later. Biographers and critics often suggest that Poe's frequent theme of the death of a beautiful woman stems from the repeated loss of women through his life, including his wife. It is said that Poe was increasingly unstable after his wife's death. He attempted to court poet Sarah Whitman, who lived in Providence, Rhode Island. Their engagement failed reportedly because of Poe's drinking and erratic behavior. There is also strong evidence that Whitman's mother intervened and did much to derail their relationship. Poe then returned to Richmond, Virginia, and resumed a relationship with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Royster. On October 7, 1849, Edgar Allen Poe died. And just like his poems and stories, the circumstances around his death are shrouded in mystery. Back up to September 27, 1849, Poe left Richmond, Virginia on his way home to New York City. To this day, there is no reliable evidence that exists about his whereabouts until a week later on October 3rd, where he was found delirious in Baltimore at Ryan's Tavern. Poe was never coherent long enough to explain how he came to be in that condition, and it is believed that the clothes he was wearing were not his own, in part because wearing dirty, tattered clothing was out of character for him. John Joseph Moran was Poe's attending physician. Moran cared for Poe at the Washington College Hospital. At first, he was denied any visitors and was confined in a prison-like room with barred windows in a section of the building reserved for drunk people. Moran claimed that Poe had not the slightest odor of liquor upon his breath or person. Even so, some newspapers at the time reported Poe's death as congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation. These were euphemisms for deaths from disgrace caused by alcoholism. Poe spent his final days wavering between fits of delirium, gripping by visual hallucinations. Poe is said to have repeatedly called out the name Reynolds on the night before his death, though no one has ever been able to identify the person to whom he referred. Moran also claimed that he attempted to cheer up Poe during one of his few times that he was awake. When Moran told Poe that he would soon be enjoying the company of friends, Poe allegedly replied that the best thing his friend could do would be to blow his brains out with a pistol. In Poe's distressed state, he made reference to a wife in Richmond. He may have been delusional, thinking that his wife Virginia was still alive, or he may have been referring to Sarah Royster, to whom he had recently proposed. Moran reported that Poe's final words were, "Lord help my poor soul," before dying on October 7, 1849. Unfortunately, all the relevant medical records have been lost, including Poe's death certificate. In 2020, psychological analysis of Poe's language theorized that he was suffering from a major depressive episode near the end of his life, and that suicide could not be ruled out. However, the evidence for suicide was not consistently present in Poe's professional writings, leading to the researchers to conclude that depression may have played a role in his death, but suicide seemed unlikely. In 2006, tests of a sample of Poe's hair provided evidence against the possibility of lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, or similar toxic heavy metal exposures. In 1999, public health researcher Albert Donay argued that Poe's death was a result of carbon monoxide poisoning from coal gas that was used for indoor lighting during the 19th century. Donay took clippings of Poe's hair and tested them for certain heavy metals that would be able to reveal the presence of coal gas. The test was inconclusive, leading biographers and historians to largely discredit Dawnay's theory. There is also a lot of ideas that have come up over the years that have centered around the fact that Poe couldn't handle alcohol. It has been documented that after a glass of wine, he was staggering drunk. His sister had the same problem. It seemed to be something hereditary, but according to Moran, he didn't have liquor on his breath or himself. One interesting theory suggests that Poe was found on the day of an election. It was suggested as early as 1872 that he was the victim of cooping. This was a ballot box stuffing scam in which victims were abducted off the streets by local election gangs, imprisoned in a small room called the coop. They were drugged or forced with alcohol to get them to comply or face beatings. The cooping victims were then used as pawns to vote for political parties at multiple locations. Often their clothing would be changed to fool voting officials and vote multiple times, or they would be given disguises such as fake wigs, beards, and mustaches. Cooping had become a standard explanation for Poe's death in most of his biographies for several decades, which would also explain the dirty and disheveled clothing that he was wearing when he was found, though his status in Baltimore may have made him too recognizable for the scam to have worked. More recently, analysis has been presented suggesting that Poe's death resulted from rabies, possibly contracted from rat bites during his cooping captivity. It fits the narrative as he was admitted to the hospital due to lethargy and confusion. His condition began a rapid downward spiral. Shortly, he was exhibiting delirium, visual hallucinations, wide variations in pulse rates, and rapid, shallow breathing. Within 4 days, the median length of survival after onset of serious rabies symptoms, Poe was dead. When Poe died, he was buried, rather unceremoniously, in an unmarked grave in Baltimore graveyard. 26 years later, a statue honoring Poe was erected near the graveyard's entrance. Poe's coffin was dug up, and his remains were exhumed in order to be moved. However, more than 2 decades of buried decay had not been kind, and Poe's coffin fell apart as workers tried to move it from one part of the graveyard to another. Little remained of Poe's body, but one worker did remark on a strange feature on Poe's skull, a mass rolling around inside. Newspapers of the day claimed that the clump was Poe's brain, shriveled yet intact after almost 3 decades in the ground. We know that today the mass could not have been Poe's brain, which is one of the first parts of the body to rot after death. But Matthew Pearl, an American author who wrote a novel about Poe's death, was nonetheless intrigued by this clump. He contacted a forensic pathologist who told him that while the clump couldn't be a brain, it could be a brain tumor, which can calcify after death into hard mass. A New York physician once told Poe that he had a lesion on his brain that caused his adverse reactions to alcohol. To this day, we really will never know what happened in the final days of Edgar Allan Poe, and perhaps in a way, the veil of mystery is how he would want to leave us, as though ripped directly from the pages of his own works. However, his legacy as one of the first successful American writers lives on. His gothic horror and macabre tone has given inspiration to many over the years, and has solidified his name in history, and as a person of interest that starts our news. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Poison Culture Podcast. Give us a like and review if you can. Find us on Instagram at Poison Culture Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Cody Gregory, and until next time, stay spooky.